origins of this new democracy. It's really important to be able to say in what ways Jacksonian democracy sort of fulfills its reputation and in what ways it fell short. And we're going to evaluate that at the end. All right, universal white manhood suffrage. Everybody say it after me. Universal white manhood suffrage.
Manhood suffrage.
Okay, so emphasis white and man. Okay. Nevertheless, okay, so universal white manhood suffrage essentially means that white males of voting age, despite property qualifications or, economic qualifications, get to vote. And what really happened was, as land was more cheap and available out west, property qualifications became less meaningful, right? So the vote basically becomes available to all white males, essentially, of voting age. And it's undeniable that expands the democratic process, that allows more people to vote. It's not just the elite, it's not just the business owners, it's the everyday common man. And I think to this day we debate about whether or not that's a good thing in some ways. Do you want someone who, has never looked at a newspaper or, watched the news or anything voting on political issues? It's a good question. Do you want voters voting when they don't know what they're talking about? But nevertheless, it was an expansion of democracy. Guys, you're welcome to come in. You just can't block the door. Thank you. All right. So you get heroes like Davy Crockett that are being voted into Congress based upon their sort of tough, woodsman-y kind of, bear-killing reputation. That's how I got my job. Outrage over the corrupt bargain of 1824. This is when John Quincy Adams, the election was thrown into Congress, and supposedly John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay made a deal. You throw the votes towards me, I'll give you the Secretary of State position. So outrage over that. Henry Clay, not a very popular president, could never really overcome the taint of that, etc. And here he is looking kind of sour.
How many times did he run?
Oh, God. 5? 3? Yeah. 4. All right. Thank you. Revolution of 1828 is when basically Jacksonians say, we're going to make sure this doesn't happen again. We're going to make sure, because Jackson had won the popular vote in the previous election. And so you can see here that he wins the popular vote, but he really wins the Electoral College here in 1828. They vote in their common man president, even though he was very wealthy, but he was a self-educated man. He had a huge mansion, a hermitage, and slaves and whatnot. All right. Old Hickory, hero of the common man, and this new expansion of the vote. All right. This, just is a picture of the sort of crazy inauguration where people stepped with mud on the furniture and spilled the bowls of punch, and, people were like, oh my gosh, what's just happening, to our country? And, it was really a change from sort of the elite that ran the country before. All right. Spoil system or rotation of office. All right. Andrew Jackson will call it rotation of office. Hey, let everybody participate in government. Let a plumber become the head of the customs house in New York City. Let, the average person be, a judge. I don't know if they could have been a judge, but get a civil service job. What the critics will say is it's a spoil system, that you're rewarding your economic supporters, your political supporters with jobs that they very often are not qualified to have. And so that was an issue at the time, and that remains an issue through Grant and other people. Jackson and Native Americans, do we need to say much more? Not a good thing. What you have to realize, though, is that most people supported Andrew Jackson and his policies at the time. There were a lot of people who had family members who were killed by Native Americans. There was a lot of fear about violence on the part of Native Americans, especially as people spread out west. And so there were a lot of Americans that were very, very sympathetic to Andrew Jackson's policies as well as Congress's policies at this time. All right, so, here you have the so-called 5 civilized tribes, the Cherokees, Creeks, Choctaws, Chickasaws, and Seminoles, that were acknowledged for their writing, having a written language as compared to other groups, all of these tribes will be removed by Andrew Jackson. Their so-called civilized credentials are not going to matter when whites want their land. You have the Indian Removal Act of 1830, and we'll show you the visuals of that, basically removing Native Americans from the eastern seaboard west to the Oklahoma Territory. You have Cherokee Nation versus Georgia. When gold is discovered on Cherokee land in Georgia, the Cherokees will appeal to the Supreme Court, and this is where John Marshall basically says, you guys are not a foreign nation but a domestic dependent nation, therefore you can't sue in the Supreme Court. However, he starts to affirm that Georgia should not have a say in taking over territory because they're under the protective wing of the federal government. Worcester versus Georgia, that had to do with missionaries that were living in the Cherokee Territory. And basically what, again, Marshall says, as a domestic dependent protection and therefore not subject to Georgia law, but the mood and the tone in Georgia was, we want their land, we want their gold, and Jackson basically felt that he could not protect the Cherokees or was not willing to protect the Cherokees or put the resources towards doing that. But what you need to know is Marshall tried to protect Native Americans, Jackson won't, Congress won't. So really it's only the Supreme Court that is speaking for the Cherokees and Native Americans at this time. Black Hawk War, April of 1832. Just an example of Sac and Fox Indians had been kicked off their land. They're starving to death. They come back to try to plant a crop, and they're annihilated by the military. Indian Bureau created in 1836. It won't be a tremendous friend to the Indians. It will usually favor whites. What was, by and large, the policy of the American government towards Native Americans, the most common policy of Native Americans from this time through Eisenhower, with the exception of the New Deal, maybe? What? Well, the movement to Oklahoma was in the Indian removal, but after that, what's the next policy? All of our the Dawes Act, all of that was to assimilate, that they should assimilate. And even Eisenhower wanted to sort of move Native Americans to the cities so that they would eventually disappear, as a separate group and culture. So, assimilation. All right, so here you can see the removal, the Seminoles from Florida, the Creeks, the Choctaws, Chickasaws, and the Cherokees on their Trail of Tears. Just the famous Trail of Tears, 1835 to 39. 4 of the 17,000 Cherokees that were removed died. There was a Civil War soldier that had been, obviously had fought in the Civil War, but previously had witnessed the Trail of Tears. And he stated something like, I've seen some of the most bloodiest, horrible battles of the Civil War, the worst kinds of cruelties one could imagine, but I've never seen something as cruel as I witnessed during the Trail of Tears. And this will be, the American government will not be a friend to Native Americans. Those people who were entrusted to deal with them will, basically steal, lie, cheat, and rob, the Indian rings of the Grant eras and whatnot. So it's not going to be a good time. All right, women in the age of Jackson, the cult of domesticity. You guys remember during the earlier time period, you've got Republican motherhood, right, after the Revolutionary War. And that was the concept that women had a role in raising good American citizens, right, civic virtue, right? In some ways, during the Jacksonian era, women take a step back.